In this episode, I'm joined by Jennifer Degenhardt, and we are going to talk about using stories in our world language classroom. And in these stories, there are opportunities for what we will call windows and mirrors. So it's a window into the experience of others, so students can learn about that, as well as a mirror so that they can actually see themselves reflected in the stories that you're using in your classroom. Let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome on in the World Language Classroom Podcast. And I am joined today by Jennifer Degenhardt. Now, this is likely a name you've heard. And if you haven't heard that name, you have seen her books around. And her books are being used in classrooms all over the country to help students dive into literacy and cultural topics. There are so many cool teachers doing things out there. And I see them at conferences and on Twitter, and I actually just want to spend more time with them. And so I wanted an excuse for all of these people to hang out with me. And so I figured start a podcast and we can have an excuse to hang out together. So thank you, Jennifer, so much for being with us today.
Joshua, I am so happy to be with you, and thank you for that great introduction. I don't know that I'm all that cool, but I am really happy to spend time with you because I think the same of you.
Oh, thank you so much, so much. I would love for you to share with us a bit about your journey as a teacher and how you evolved into being an author along the way.
Well, I chose teaching because it was the path of least resistance, really. Both of my parents were teachers, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And my parents both loved teaching, at varying degrees at different times of their lives. But when I graduated from college, I went into the family profession, so to speak, and I found that I loved it too. And mostly, I love teaching to be with young people. Spanish is just happened to be what I had the most credits in, which was good because I really enjoy it very much. And the best part about teaching for me is watching students' eyes and their whole beings light up when they get it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that happens in history class or maybe in math class, but that's what I really like. And I was a teacher in public school for 24 years until the school where I was teaching at and I reached a detente and we needed to separate, and I didn't really know what I was going to do after that. And I had started writing these books for my students when I was teaching high school, and I found that I loved it. I just loved to dive into the story and figure out what was going on, and so I kept doing that. And which kept me going at least, on a personal level. So when I had the first year I wasn't teaching in high school and I had published maybe, 10 books, I figured, this might be a thing.
Wow. What was that first book that you wrote for your students in your classroom?
I wrote La Chica Nueva, the new girl. And I wrote that I was so blessed to be able to teach two classes of primarily students with learning challenges. And they were not buying the regular curriculum. They were bored out of their minds. I was bored and frustrated. And if I was bored and frustrated, they would be just the same. So I said, there's got to be a better way. And I don't know where the idea came from. I had used other CI readers in class, but I knew that there was no way I could get them to buy into those particular stories. So I said, well, maybe I can write my own. And I went home and I dug out all of the stuff, all the curriculum that I was supposed to cover in and mapped it out into a story. And out came Taruka and Cooper.
Wow. When you were using that first story with your students, did you write the entire story before using it with students, or did you sort of go along the way with them in the classroom?
No, I wrote it all actually, and I don't know if I'm proud to say this, but I wrote the first draft of the story in a week. And I evidently needed to come out, and I would go home and write some, and then I think, okay, I need to include these next topics or vocabulary or grammatical structures. And I used to swim in the morning before school, and so I'd go and I'd solve all the problems while I was doing laps, and then I'd use I'd use some of the structures in class, and then I'd go home in the evening and write some more. So I had all of the story written for the most part before I gave it to students.
So you referred to this as a CI reader. So what does that mean to you to use that term, a CI reader? And CI meaning comprehensible input, to make sure everyone is on board with that.
Well, I am not a pedagogue by any stretch of the imagination. So the CI to me means providing students something that they can comprehend, comprehensible, and so that they can use that for their own output. And I don't know, that probably doesn't strike a chord with what it actually is, but to me, with the students that I had at the time, that's exactly what happened. They were able to understand what I was giving them, because there's a lot of repetition in the beginning, and with the repetition they built up the confidence, and when we were able to start talking about things, I mean, they just lit up. So that's and you can, on another podcast episode, you can correct all of my wrong things, and that's okay.
No, it is not wrong. You have, these are such useful and actionable resources for the classroom. There's nothing wrong with what you're doing. Nothing to correct at all.
Okay.
At all. So the thing that sticks out for me personally as a teacher when I'm looking at your stories and considering the different options is how many different voices and experiences are represented. It is not what I would call the typical story. And typically and historically in legacy ways of teaching, there was a single view of an experience. And in your books, the characters and the stories are, I'm going to use the word diverse, but I don't think that even honors it enough to say what your stories are. So can you talk a little bit about where your stories come from and the characters that you create?
Yes. The first story that I wrote was The New Girl is about a young Bolivian girl who moves to the town, a non-diverse town. And I taught in the school where, my experiences were based from, and that I included in the story, because I wanted my students to be able to find themselves in the story. But also I wanted to introduce the theme of what it's like to be a new person in that town, and a person of color. And while it's not my story to tell, I was able to witness that with some of the students who were either new to town or people of color that didn't, for lack of a better term, did not blend in. And I wanted my students to really understand that, to create that empathy. And that was where La Chica Nueva was born of. And since that time, I have thought, well, what must it be like for other students? Everyone needs to be able to see themselves in a book. And what wasn't presented with textbooks, clearly I was not using them, but was the real cultural stuff. I mean, what do we want to talk about with kids? I didn't want to talk about, a museum. I didn't want to talk about a church. I wanted to talk about people. Language is about people, and I
Mm-hmm.
love people.
Mm-hmm.
And I want all of the people to be able to see themselves in a story. And I want the people who are not of that group to know what it's like, or to at least have some idea, to
Mm-hmm.
create that empathy. I know that it's, yes, to teach language is to give students an opportunity to communicate with other people, but I also think that cultural dexterity and cultural empathy will do far more for our interconnectedness than anything else. The
Right.
language we can figure out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, the I hear a lot in my own school, the particularly in the elementary part of the school, they talk about the concept of windows and mirrors. Where students, there's an opportunity to look out the window and learn about a new experience, but then also those opportunities for the mirror to see yourself reflected in the story. And that's what I see in the stories that you create, is the opportunity for the mirror, which is not always there. So I really appreciate the fact that that's a part of your process. Could you tell us a bit about where your stories come from? Like, where do you come up with these characters, and how do you get to know them, and then how do you introduce them to the world?
Well, I chat with a lot of people and I listen. I pride myself in being a very good listener, and I remember things because like I said, I do love people and I love their stories. I like to ask those probing questions. Where did that idea come from? Why are you like this? Why? And not in a negative way, just trying to understand a little bit more. And I really don't know where these characters come from. I come up with an idea. Actually, many friends of mine will say, "Oh, you should write a story about,"
Mm-hmm.
and I think, "Oh, well, that's ridiculous. I don't have time to write a story about." And by the end of the next day, I have all the story mapped out. In fact, Maria, about Hurricane Maria, I was in an exchange. It was during a very not bright period of my life, right after I left my job. This woman on Facebook said, "Oh, you should write a series of books about Hurricane Maria and use those proceeds as donations." And I thought, lady, do you have any idea how hard it is to write a book? And I was mad at her for the entire day. I never even met her, of course, but I was mad at her for the entire day. And of course, my response was, well, she's right. And so, and I fleshed out the story by the end of the evening. And that to me is the most exciting part. I just take little ideas, and it's sort of like a dare. If someone says, well, you should write a story about curling, that I would find out, okay, well, where do they practice curling? How does that relate to, since I write in Spanish first, how does that relate to Hispanic culture, or Spanish speaking nations, and just sort of put it all together. I mean, there are some of my stories that where, how would you ever put those things together? But I managed to figure it out, and that's the
Right.
most exciting part.
And that authentic piece in there, could you tell us a little bit about how you kind of check in about the authenticity of it? So, sort of, I am a cisgendered white male, and if I were writing a story about a Black female and I'm writing from a first person perspective, that's not my lived experience. And so when you're writing that character, how do you make sure that you're keeping it authentic?
I think that I use most of my observations
Mm-hmm.
and of my own students, and I will check in with them also after I've written something and farm it out to them. I teach at the college level now, so they'll provide some feedback, but paying attention to what people do and how they are in the world informs a lot of what a lot of how I write the characters. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that I try very, very hard to steer in the entirely opposite direction of stereotypes, because
Mm-hmm.
that's not how people live. And I think that keying into the human experience, that's universal.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't matter really. I mean, especially, with a lot of times language contributes to the culture of a person. Absolutely it does. So, keeping things really at the surface level, but creating empathy for the character of the human, him, her, or themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's the most important thing to me.
Mm-hmm. So you had talked about writing initially in Spanish with your stories, but now they have been, I'm going to say translated, but I think I should probably say rewritten in other languages, particularly French. Have there been other languages or just French for now?
French, and I do have them in English for
Oh,
ESL
okay.
students, and I have a couple books in German, and I have Italian coming out too.
Oh,
Yeah.
so
So
the interesting thing about it, I'm a French and Spanish teacher, is I've seen the versions, and typically when we think of translation, it's you just translate the language, but it's actually in some cases the story is completely transformed because it needs to take place in a different culture. So, could you talk about that process of collaborating and the translating not just the language but the cultural experience in a book as well?
yes, to me, the culture part is probably more important than the language
Hmm.
in my estimation. So it's so important that the culture is relevant to the language being read in the book, because what are we going to read about Argentina in French? It doesn't make much sense to
Hmm.
me. But adapting it to the language being read is important. So I make sure that people who are doing the translation of my book know this and have that ability to move the story.
Hmm.
First move the story and then figure out the little the cultural nuances. I don't think, if you read my stories, it's not, some of them are not really that in depth culturally. So they are able to be moved.
Hmm.
And if it's for example, one of my stories, which is La Última Prueba, which is based on the Mayan myth, that one is not going to be translated and adapted for French, because it's
Hmm.
just not translatable or adaptable. Well, translatable it is, but adaptable not.
Hmm.
But the people with whom I've worked have really understood that process and how important it is to me. I said,
Hmm.
keep the storyline the same for the most part. The conflict needs to be the same. The resolution needs to be the same,
Hmm.
but the culture absolutely has to be on.
Right. What I find in your stories is you had just said that it doesn't go really into depth culturally. I think it goes far enough where it's easy to pull in authentic resources to go along with the story. Okay, you're getting very excited. Talk
Yeah, I'm
about
very
that.
excited because yes, as an author and as a teacher, that's what I would want, is to be able to add my own flair and bring in other authentic resources, and keeping the culture at a name mention level, and allowing the teacher, if the teacher uses the books as a class novel, to bring in the things that he or she or they like, because that's, to me, the most exciting part
Hmm.
about teaching, is to put my own personal spin on it.
Hmm.
And if I can get excited about it, I can definitely sell it to them. And also, I am not a historian. I am not even a very good researcher. I like to just put the puzzle pieces together and offer it up. Here you go.
Hmm.
Take with this and do with it what you will. Put your own spin on it, because this is only a guide, and it's
Hmm.
something to talk about, because we can always talk about characters that have conflicts much easier than we can talk about ourselves having the same ones.
Hmm.
And with the racism and the LGBTQ issues, and the economic disparity that I mention in the books that I write, it's so much easier to talk about those themes with the characters, and not
Hmm.
have to talk about, student A lives in a single parent home, and student B, is whatever. You know what I mean? I'm just talking about those sorts of disparities in real life.
Mm-hmm. I noticed that you take on topics that are sometimes scary for teachers. They're not exactly sure how to take on LGBTQ issues or take on income disparity or particularly racism with particular races. And it's just sort of, oh, we're going to talk about that today, and it's an awkward introduction of the topic just to talk about it. But the fact that you bring it in a story that's connected to humanity kind of gives teachers a way of bringing that into their classroom.
And I think that these kinds of conversations need to take place more and more and more with our students. I don't know about you, but I think our generation, I don't know how old you are, but my generation for sure has messed a lot of things up. And I'm putting a lot of faith in the younger generation, and they seem to be much more aware and open about things, and just providing these opportunities. Nothing is scary unless we ascribe that feeling towards it. I mean, it just is. LGBTQ issues, they're not really issues. They're human beings, and just presenting them as such, it just lowers that affective filter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's what I enjoy about presenting these stories.
Yeah. So speaking of students, do you ever hear from students who have or teachers who have used their books in your classroom, and what's the feedback you get from them?
Well, you're gonna make me cry.
Oh, do it. We love
I
that.
yeah, I do hear from teachers a lot, and a lot about students that have come to them and thanked them for giving them the book Los Tres Amigos or Les Trois Amis, and just allowing them to see themselves in the books. And this was right before the pandemic started last year. I met a teacher at Nechtville who said, "Oh, I'm so glad I caught you. I have to get another." I was cleaning up from the conference, and she says, "I'm so glad I caught you. I have to get another copy of Los Tres Amigos. I gave mine away to a student whom I thought could benefit from it." And it wasn't until the following fall she came to me and said, "I didn't know it was going to be okay until I read this book, and I finally came out to my parents, and it's going to be okay." And I was bawling,
Mm-hmm.
and I think of it still. I'm crying now, and you can see me, but that's why I do what I do. I just want kids to feel like they matter.
Mm-hmm.
And if they can just find that just a little bit of comfort by reading a book, then I've done a good job.
Yeah. And just looking through their immigration stories, there are stories that involve racism. There's so many of these lived experiences. And when we look at these sort of CI, comprehensible input readers, these leveled readers, we sometimes think about it, it's the class curriculum that the whole class is reading it together, but they are also incredibly useful for the classroom library, for those voluntary reading times where it sounds like that's where the student was reading it. It was the book they pulled off the shelf in the target language that's a level they can understand, where they can see themselves. And that is so powerful. So
Thank you.
powerful.
Yeah, I just finished a graphic novel earlier this year with artwork done by a high school student, because I do like to work with students all the time. And I wanted to make sure that there were some resources in the story itself for students to access if they needed it. So it's a story about a transgender male high school student and a girl that they develop a cool connection during COVID. And I made sure to include the crisis text line and the Trevor Project and information on how to, just so that it was embedded in there for those students who might need that just as I'm just reading a book, and if they could take a picture with their phone or write it down or something like that. I feel for students, and not for any other reason. I mean, I don't identify as part of the community except as an ally, but I just love people, and I want them to feel like I feel now, which is great.
Yes. And a teacher who's choosing to have a book. I'm looking specifically at the book that's the story of the Haitian father who travels illegally to the United States. And for a teacher to have that story in their classroom, it says I'm an ally and I understand and I'm open to learn more if this is an avenue that opens up for us to have a conversation. So that's important.
It is important. I think it's to have different stories for all of the student population, regardless of whether they identify with the characters or even if they just see through the window, as you mentioned earlier. It's kind to present everything and not just limit them to the single view focus.
So I like to pivot from sort of the informational part of a lot of what we talk about in these podcasts. There's a lot of information, and to make sure that we also look at inspiration. And you seem incredibly inspired to do what you do. And where does your inspiration come from? Where we can pull from that, and I can try some of that as well.
I go out into the world, which I don't leave the house often these days much, but I pay attention to people. And I think that if we can draw inspiration from each other, I met a very nice man on my return trip from Guatemala in May, and I've already started his story. Something he inspired in me to tell that story. I'm listening to my students and wanting to incorporate their stories into stories that I tell. I think just love what you do and figure out why. I mean, I like to put the puzzle pieces together, and also to make it easier for teachers to have these kinds of conversations, because nobody really cares if you can conjugate a verb, when it's all said and done. But to be able to engage in a conversation, that's the most important thing. I know I didn't answer the question, but
not at all. Inspiration comes in so many different ways. Because this is the sort of segment of our conversation where I like to just pull the teacher curtain back a little bit.
Okay.
And we're going to get to know Jennifer. Do you prefer to go by Jen or Jennifer? I see it in two different ways.
Jen. Mostly Jen, okay. But Jennifer I have on my books.
Okay. Well, I always see your name as Jennifer on your book, so that's in my mind. But Jen. Okay, so now this is clearly the Jen part.
Okay.
All right. We're going to pull back. Okay. And I reach out to teachers for these this or that, like on Twitter. What are some good this or that's?
Okay.
To gain some insight. Okay. So some just this or that's. So if you had the choice between a road trip and a destination trip you had to fly to get to, which would you choose?
Destination trip. I don't like to drive.
Oh, so you're not a road trip person.
I'm not a road trip person, no.
Not a road trip person. I would agree with the destination.
Yeah.
I'm about that. I know that we're supposed to like it's about the journey, not the destination. I get that. Yeah. But I like the destination too.
Absolutely.
And if there is a big gathering of people for a party or something, or a small, more intimate gathering, which one would you choose?
Oh, the intimate gathering. Very much so. I do love people, but I like the conversation. I love to dig in and to find out about people. I don't want to, I don't do the chitty chatty.
Oh, not the chitty chatty.
No, I don't really like it.
You want to go deeper. You need to find your next story.
I do. I'm mining people's minds for the next story. Absolutely.
Yes. I so appreciate this time with you. Okay. And I want to make sure that everyone that's listening can connect with you. Where's the best way to connect with you to go further with these conversations?
You can find me on Facebook. I do also have a Facebook group called World Language Teaching Stories. I'm on Instagram at I don't
I
even
will
know.
put
Put
it in
it
the
in
show
there. I
notes.
don't
It'll
even
be in the
know.
show notes.
Listen,
Yeah.
find me on social media. I go by my name
Okay.
because I don't, I know you're supposed to hide your identity, but this is who I am. The FBI can come after me if they want.
Yeah.
'Cause
I will make sure I mostly connect with you through Twitter, so I will make sure that your Twitter account and your Instagram is in the show notes. And I will also make sure that teachers can go to your website if they want to look into your books as well.
that would be perfect. That would be
Excellent.
so perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this time together and for inspiring teachers with your stories and all the work that you do.
Thank you very much, Joshua, for having me.
Some really great takeaways in that conversation with Jennifer about finding those opportunities and stories for windows and mirrors with our students so that they can see themselves reflected and feel valued, but also to learn about the lived daily experience of others so that when they interact, they can do it in a more respectful and authentic way by truly and authentically understanding it. Be sure to check out the show notes so you can connect with Jennifer, and there's also a link in there to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly newsletter, where you will get some tips about teaching language and also be notified when new episodes of the podcast are out so that you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for listening. We will talk soon. Bye for now. You've been listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss a single episode. Let's continue the conversation on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at WL Classroom. You can also see over 250 blog posts about language teaching at, you guessed it, WLClassroom.com.